like to invite up our additional panelists in addition to our presenters too. We have John Livingston, who is CEO of Verve Industrial. And we have Christopher Blavelt, who is Director of Operational Technologies, US East for Fortinet. So just to kick off, John, why don't we start with you? Just give us a couple of words about what you do and, why you're here and so forth, and then we'll move on to Chris.
Sure. So I'm John
real
Livingston. As Larry said, I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. And we talked, I think, in the session with the various introductions, but we're an OT cybersecurity solution provider. We have a platform that helps our clients both manage the endpoints as well as the overall security management program. And then we provide a range of services, such as Tim was describing, around the overall program development and helping clients manage their overall OT security programs.
Chris Blavelt, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, can we get Chris's microphone up a little bit?
Yeah. So Chris Blavelt, Director of Operational Technology at Fortinet. I spent 10 years in the power industry, came to Fortinet because I wanted to help create solutions that could protect ICS. So spent time as plant manager, designer of SCADA systems, and I believe I'm an OT whisperer as well.
All right. Sid, did you have any questions from the audience to start off with? Otherwise, I'll just get us started here. I would like to talk about developing people and training because I think that was a pretty common theme in both of your presentations. It's not something we've talked about much, in the previous session or in other sessions that I've seen. So let's talk about developing people. I mean, developing these comprehensive cybersecurity programs in plant environments is very human resource intensive. Cybersecurity is not necessarily a domain of expertise for the everyday OT person. And Tim, you and I were talking about this earlier. I want your thoughts on, are you developing your own cybersecurity experts from within the OT world? Are you hiring people from IT and teaching them OT? What's the best way to go about developing expertise within your company for OT cybersecurity? Anybody care to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly jump in.
Sure.
I did mention it in our group. I mean, we partnership with our IT side of the business on the security piece, but we want our staff to be, I mentioned it, the presentation, to be level at a certain certification. We're going to use the ISA certification as our baseline. I do have several SCADA people with SAN certification as well. And in fact, one of our IT analysts, our security analyst, just took his OT SAN certification. So it's a two-way street. It's really good when the IT department understands what we do, what our challenges are, and vice versa. We need to understand what the IT department does, why they do what they do, and how we can apply that to our business. So it's can't be afraid of losing people either once you get them trained. I mean, that's
No, you can't. Yeah, and SANS has some great training. I know that. Tim, you want to comment?
So we do a combination. We do a hybrid. So we take a combination of the OT resources that are there, provide training for them. We could train them in basic cybersecurity training, and we also expand that into giving them a different, what we call badge of honor. So we take them to the levels of what does it mean to get cyber certified or training in both IT and OT. Then we're looking at them as being ambassadors to help train other folks within the plants and facilities. So they're that go-to person to help bridge the gap. And yes, we expect that at some point we're going to lose those folks, but that we're bringing in a younger talent pool as well and making them junior cyber ambassadors to help to ensure that there's a transition in there as well.
Both good points.
Can I add one? The training is one piece, but I think the education for all the employees is huge. I can't, we've had a great program, had specific programs for our operators, our supervisors, our management on OT security, as well as all the aspects of cybersecurity from an IT perspective and a personal perspective. And that needs to just be continuous, but it needs to be targeted and short. If you're doing anything more than 5 minutes once a month, you're losing your audience really quickly, and it needs to be kind of fun. And don't know what else to say. I know training's usually not fun. I've been to thousands of hours of safety training. It's never really fun, but it's necessary, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was about to bring up, is that we spend a lot of time on electrical safety training, right? Everybody in your plant has probably taken electrical safety training, hazardous material handling safety training. Cyber is really no different, right? It's a threat to your environment. It can be a threat to health and safety. You have your generalists that know the basics, and then you might have your electricians, you might have your material handlers who are the experts. And really, OT cybersecurity is no different.
Yes, do we have a question from the audience? Please just let us know who you are and your company.
Hi there, Roberto Pena with DuPont. Tim, you had mentioned taking a full inventory of all the software, all the devices and everything before going into developing your EDR plan. How did you do that? How long did it take, and what tools did you use, or how difficult was that?
Yeah, anybody can jump in anytime. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, could you clarify the question again? I'm so sorry, I'm apologize. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you had mentioned about taking a full inventory of all the devices, all of the software, and just wondering how you went about doing that. Was it very difficult? I know we're starting to take our inventories and having a very difficult time with some of that.
Yes, that is the biggest. That's a very interesting question. I appreciate that one. That's actually where you do a combination of your audit process, because there's your time. You have internal auditors who are constantly going around assessing your environment. They're helping with your inventories. You're going to your quality systems and getting the inventories. Until you get a tool that's actually doing discovery of everything, then you have to do some of these manual inventory assessments and collections and help dump them into some type of database or your service management type tool or ticketing system, so that you can actually have a good inventory of your assets, knowing you're going to still have gaps, and you can always be monitoring this on a continuous basis.
Anybody else want to comment?
I mean, I can comment, we operate 850 facilities. It could be a pressure sensor in the side of the road, or it could be a large water treatment plant. I will tell you, we probably don't have as much information on those small sites. The larger plants, we have more information. We try to put everything on our side in our asset management system, at least from a component that has an Ethernet connection on it, right? So we know what it is, or even a serial connection. Yes, we still use RS-232, 485 communication. We want to make sure that we capture that, maybe not at the granular level of what firmware, what level you might have with the tool, but at least we know we have, PLC XYZ, and it was installed in 2015.
I just comment on when you do deploy the technology to do this, the way we approach that from our technology point of view is you have to get to the endpoint. So whether it be on a Windows, Unix, Linux system, actually using an OT-specific endpoint agent to gather that data. And then the way we do it, although there's lots of options, the way we do it is we will then go specifically to those end devices we discover through our agent and communicate with them in their native protocols to pull back that data. So if it's a Rockwell PLC, we'll communicate in the SIP protocol. We'll then SIP path out the back end of that through the back end to the NPT cards and the devices around that SIP pathing. Similarly, whether it be a Siemens S7 or you name it, right? The only way to really get that from a technology point of view is you have to be at the endpoint. The stuff just unfortunately isn't on the quote unquote wire, right? You're not going to get the firmware version on the wire. And so the way we've designed ours is to literally go and ask the device. And the only way you can do that is to have the OT whisperers to do that in a really safe way. And we've been doing it for about 30 years. So otherwise you can, if you're not doing that exactly right, you can cause issues, but we've figured out how to deal with that. So.
Just to follow up, we've noticed as we started taking our inventories, and even just the devices that are on our process control network, not counting all of the unnetworked ones, or as you say, the IO and those types of things, or the private networks, we're finding that we have a lot more devices on the OT network than you have on a business network. And it's not something that our IT folks or even our business managers have recognized before. So how have you been able to stress the difference between an OT network and an IT network and just the sheer size and the number of devices that you have to deal with?
I'll jump on what John said. We had an incident early on with the new cybersecurity piece where they went to a facility without an OT person and, bricked the PLCs. So that was a quick education and level set everyone real quick that, hey, we're different. And when we break, we are 24/7. That's the fact of life. Fortunately, we have protocols to operate manually and take care of it to get the stuff recovered. So that was a good education to our team that, hey, we're different. But it's just communication. I mean, that's really an education. I always ask, do you have a hard hat? Do you have safety shoes? Let's take a walk. Let's walk through everything. Show them every dirty nook and cranny of a facility that you have. I always like to take them to the worst wastewater treatment plant we have. You're going to separate the men from the boys at that point, but it's good to get that experience and let them know this is what we're doing. We're controlling a piece of equipment that someone might work on. There's a safety issue. Our product's consumed. One of the few products that goes through a pipe someone consumes, or we have to use fire service. So it's very important that we have that mindset going in. It's just communication and education and developing that trust and partnership.
I'd always say that I'm everyone's son because no matter where I went, they'd say, listen, son, right? When we mess up, people can die, right? And so, they weren't saying that to make themselves feel big. They were saying that to stress the importance of, you're DuPont. When things go wrong, explosions can happen, right? Whereas if the email goes down, that's extremely inconvenient, but nobody dies. And so, like he said, get that hard hat on. Where's your safety toe shoes? And if you don't have that, you're not even coming into my environment, right? I find when I put those things on, it's like, when I was in the Army, putting on my uniform. It changes your mindset. And things like that can change your mindset. Whereas if you're back in the office, fiddling with a keyboard, you can forget the ramifications of what you're doing.
One of the things is that in terms of how do you communicate to IT that these things really exist. I think one of the biggest challenges that OT has is that the data is stuck at the plants in many cases, right? And so again, maybe it's a spreadsheet or whatever. And so we find that once you pull it up into that quote unquote think global idea, right? Get all those assets centrally visible, even not all of them, like do 4 sites. And all of a sudden you pull that into a dashboard that's accessible by the senior team and they see all of those devices. Wait, what is all that stuff? Right, what are you doing with that? And then to make it more powerful, you shoot it up to their ServiceNow. We integrate with ServiceNow. All of a sudden it's in their database. And when they see it in their database, it's like, whoa, okay, now I'm adding those up and I'm adding up, and now I'm gonna multiply those 4 sites by 12 because I have 50 sites. Oh my God. But until they can visualize that with numbers by site, it's hard if it's like, oh yeah, it's out there in some dusty, right? Well, now it's a number on a sheet. It becomes a lot more obvious, I guess.
It's more than dusky. It's hot and dirty and hazardous, and these are nasty environments. They're not climate-controlled server rooms. Did you want to say something, Tim? I didn't mean to cut you off.
And then I put my risk hat on, and I take that dashboard, and I massage that data, and I present it back to the plants. I present it back to the business, and say, I have a lot of unknown assets here. Or I have a lot of unclassified assets. Now I need you, business, to tell me how you own this, because when I go back and look at the impact, if I have a cyber attack, and I tell you that this is an unknown asset, what's the risk? So I need you to put that risk hat on to go back and take a look at the assets as well.
Yeah, I went to an ICS JWG conference once, and I asked how many people ever heard of a heat tracing system, and everybody was just like, what are you talking about? So do we have another question from the audience here? I thought I saw somebody with their hand up. Oh, okay, right here, sir.
Hi, so Oren again. So this is in relation also to the discussion we just had now, and to Keith about your criteria for the EDR. So First of all, sorry that VAX was singled out. Awesome OS. PDP 11 as well. But when you talked about that selection process, you talked about the constraints for the endpoints, but we're also hearing about don't touch OT endpoints. So was there a certification process for you to decide which OT endpoints you could install the 40 EDR on? Great solution, by the way, to avoid, effects or to avoid manufacturer certifications, because that's a lot of the, if I have an endpoint agent, like I'm not allowed to install it. So what was the process on ensuring where you could install beyond just resources?
So, I mean, the delineation is we're on 98% Windows devices, right? It doesn't, we tried installing it on CE. I can't remember if we had it successful or not. But we're not on PLCs. We're not on something that does control. We're on the HMI servers. Anything that's designed to be on is where we decide to put on. And that's why we spent a lot of time in simulation mode to really understand what was being kicked out for alerts, what products were going to be isolated, and what was the effect that's going to be on our business. So that, that's where it is installed right now. We are not on the PLC endpoints. We're not on our, cell modems running Linux and that type of stuff.
Yeah, and I will say that to address that concern, we're working with every major OEM to become a certified solution for exactly that reason. I don't want to void your warranty, right? Because bad things will happen if something goes wrong. A lot of finger pointing happens. And so it's important to us that we overcome that objection as well.
Can I ask a question, Larry?
No.
Sure.
No, the thing that always comes up with the EDR, people ask me, is, this connection with the cloud. A lot of the EDR solutions, and I even though Fortinet's a client of mine, I honestly don't know the details of yours, so I'm not setting him up to make a good comment, bad comment, whatever. But, in your system, I come from the steel industry, so when you talk about dirty, filthy, horrible places, believe me, I know them very well. But I also know that nobody wants to open up those networks, and we heard that all day today. Even though I get up on the stage and say you should, everybody knows that. But I can appreciate the other side. And I'm just wondering, for the EDR, for the 40 EDR, how much of that do you need interaction with the cloud or with other things, and how do you deal with that issue? Because in the end, for an IT, the ideal thing is all of a sudden you get this data, you send it up to the cloud, can put in fancy analytics and look for all kinds of things, and and it's very powerful. But you get down to the OT and you say, well, I don't want anybody getting into that plant or out of that plant. So how are you? To what extent are you doing that, the EDR, and how do you do that? I guess is my question.
So we have two modes of operation. We have one that is usually preferred in the IT side, which is where every endpoint communicates with the cloud. I would say I have not met an OT customer where that would be okay. He's shaking his head, yeah. And so what we also have is what we call an on-prem installation. You can think of it as kind of as a proxy. And so essentially what you do is you have a server within your IDMZ. All your endpoints communicate with it. It communicates with the cloud. And so you have very tight coupling of one machine to the cloud, makes your rule sets a lot easier, and really gives that comfort factor that you don't have machines just communicating with the cloud. And we can do that in a variety of ways, whether it's IP whitelisting or things like that, to make sure that that machine can only communicate with the FortiGuard servers. Did you?
Yeah,
Thank you.
From an
You
end
couldn't hear
user
me.
perspective, that was one of our main criterias, and we whitelist that IP, we go specific, and we're like 2 DMZs deep in how we do this, and we go through our business. It's a long process, but that traffic is needed to bring that intelligence down. So it's again, what's your risk, what's your tolerance, and what do you want to mitigate? So,
And also, if you have a temporary loss of connection, we don't shut the whole thing down, right? That's also important. And we have seen some times where, maybe not EDR, but other types of solutions that use the cloud, if you lose your connection, your operations go down.
Is the EDR also doing the anti-malware type protection and stuff? Because then you have the opposite issue of sending down the doing updates and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Signature-based versus activity-based is, I think, the crux of your question. And so essentially what it does is it uses signatures, right? That's an easy way to catch known malware. But it also embeds itself in the kernel, and so uses activity profiling to determine what is malicious behavior. And then when it responds, it only responds on that process, which is also really important. You know, the talk we gave yesterday about specificity, shutting down the entire endpoint is usually not possible. And so we shut down just the malicious process, allow you to determine whether or not you want it to continue, whether or not you want to roll back anything that had changed.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, we have a question over here.
Question for Keith Blake from Exxon. The two EDR solution, one for IT and one for OT, how did you come up with that decision? What complexities did it rise, especially did it impact your SOC, and then how did you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, that's, so we were second to the party, I guess you would say. So the IT decision was already made. And just as we had that discussion on how you get that threat intelligence, that tool had to have every endpoint connected to the internet. So immediately that kind of struck it down. Also, they did not have any OT kind of experience, right? And so we looked at this at a global level, and as you know, us OT people across the world kind of stuck together, picked what we wanted to pick that worked and that we were comfortable with. So, I mean, from a SOC side, they get all our data from, through our SIEM on that side. So we try to make it as similar as possible. I will say that we had a trip on our last week on our, not on our SCADA side, but on our business side. And that same data came from our next generation firewalls that we were blocking all that kind of stuff. So they've done a good job of correlating that data, what's in the OT side, what's in the IT side. If we have a threat in the IT side, how's it affecting the OT side? So it's worked out well. We have changed our SOC provider in the last 6 months, and we're much, much happier with our new provider.
Okay, if you have any other questions, get them ready, because we got a lot of experts here. So take the opportunity to ask the questions while you can, and I'm going to ask one of my own questions. One of my areas of interest has always been alarms and alerts, and in process automation, there's the ISA 18.2 standard for alarm management. Basically, in process control, the cost of adding alarms to systems went down to zero. Anybody could do it, and then we wound up with a huge problem of too many alarms and operators ignoring alarms. Are we headed for a similar situation with cybersecurity? Can you give us any advice on how to manage alarms and alerts with cybersecurity platforms and OT cybersecurity? Any words of wisdom on how to do alarms and alerts?
Well, there are multiple questions there. So I'll
Yeah.
address the first one. Are we headed toward the same thing? I would say yes, unless we do something about it. I'd say one of the solutions is to establish a framework of what the alarms are, how they're associated. I'm a fan of MITRE ATT&CK for ICS. I'm sure there's more frameworks out there, but I think that's the most specific one for ICS that I have seen, and addresses OT's particular needs. And so correlate alarms to the cyber kill chain and to whatever standard you decide to use. And I think that will go a long way towards triaging those alarms, whether automatically or giving a framework for your SOC operators to triage.
Okay. Tim?
So I'm going to add a little bit more. I agree with everything he's saying, but I also want to add a little bit more control or structure around that. in the areas of now, as we start to look at more war gaming or tabletopping, you also want to start to set up that process of simulating, looking at those alerts and simulating a tabletop with your controls, your SOC teams to make sure that they're seeing the right alerts, they're analyzing it the right way, and they're putting together after action plans or risk approach to understand what that's meaning to the organization. Because you're going to, like you were saying, you're going to get a lot of them, and you got to be able to streamline them.
Good advice.
I just want to add on to there is that I think in ICS, we spend a lot of time making sure that we have really high confidence in our data. It is the attacker's job to give us misleading data, right, as part of that attack.
Right.
And so, there's a term within the intelligence community of deconflicting through multiple sources. We need to be prepared to say, hey, this is the alarm I have. Is there something else that confirms this information, or is this the trash can fire while they're over here, right? And there's two rules, is that, one, you won't always see the attack coming, but two, the diversion that you're ignoring is actually the main attack, right? So, you gotta make sure that you're deconflicting through multiple sources. And that's different than what we're used to as an operator of a SCADA system.
Yeah, very different. Yeah.
One of the things that we've been doing with our clients is I mentioned our history of being control systems engineers. And so we were doing alarm management on the operations process side before we got into security originally. And so we've basically taken those process alarms into the same database as our security alarms. And so what that allows you to do is, to your point, link another data set to it. So, okay, great, I'm seeing some MITRE attack alert. All right, am I actually seeing anything on the process variables? Am I actually seeing what I would expect to see, or am I now starting to see anomalous patterns of temperature, pressure, whatever? And am I seeing a change in my alarm status on the physical process side? Because at the end of the day, that's likely what an attacker is trying to do. It's not the only thing, but it is at least one thing that it's trying to do. And so by bringing in those multiple data sets to your analytics, you can start to tie pieces together, because adding that context can help you reduce the false alarms that you make.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, John. Anybody else want to comment on that? I do have another question, unless we have somebody from the.
I have a question out here.
Oh, great. Let's take that question. Yeah.
Cusimano's not allowed to ask any questions.
Yeah.
That's a rule. There's a general rule at all our conferences. Cusimano can't ask questions.
Hey, it could be a softball. John Cusimano, Deloitte. I wanted to build on what Larry, your question's a great question. How do we deal, now that we've instrumented our ICS systems and we're monitoring our networks and we know our asset inventory, and all these great tools out there help us not only identify our assets, but also identify known vulnerabilities in those assets and correlate them to CVSS scores. Now we know what we didn't know, that all these vulnerabilities, well, I guess I say we know what we knew, but it's documented. That there's all these vulnerabilities in our ICS systems that have been there for years, but now the tools have told us that they're there.
There's a report. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so it's analogous to the alarm rationalization problem. Now we have what we call a vulnerability rationalization problem. We've got all these vulnerabilities with CVSS scores, but all they tell us is the base score. It's an 8, it's a 10, and the normal response from IT is, you got to patch everything. And of course, in the ICS OT environment, that's not practical. And a 10 here in one area of the plant could be very different than a 10 here. Same PLC, but based on its functionality, where it is in the architecture. So long story short, question is vulnerability rationalization. How are you guys dealing with that? Are you feeling that, number one? And how are you dealing with that this information that you now know that potentially thousands of CVEs that are popping out of these tools? How are you managing that?
You want to go, Keith? So I'll tell you how a range of our clients are dealing with that problem. So the first is that as we think about that CVSS score, right, trying to put an overall risk score to the asset that takes CVSS, but also takes into account other dimensions of risk on the asset. So, for instance, how's that asset configured? Is it pretty well securely configured or not? Number two, is it sitting behind a firewall, multiple layers of firewalls, right? What process is it running? Is it a critical process? Is it a not critical process? Does it have EDR or whitelisting, and is that whitelisting in lockdown or not? And so what we're doing is we're essentially creating an overall risk score for the asset that CVSS is one part of, but it's a more, what we call a 360-degree score on that asset. So that's the first piece, is giving a more enriched view of the score. But then the second piece is, as we think about the program, how do we remediate those? And so working through a set of mitigating controls when I can't patch that device to say, okay, I can't patch it, but I can, shut down all non-critical ports. I can make sure my AV or EDR, whatever is engaged. I can make sure whitelisting. So I can take a number of actions that mitigate without patching until I can patch, right? Because eventually I'll want to patch those things. And then the last thing is bringing in exploit data, right? Because every CVSS score isn't the same. If I don't have or it could be, but I need to get the exploit data. So what we've done is brought in that new CISA, not new, 18 months old, whatever, the CISA database on exploits, which is wonderful. There's a lot of exploit databases out there, but that's a really nice one, that's there. And so by bringing that in, it gives another bit of context to how risky that. So there's a variety of things you can do to address the problem, but there's no, so we get a lot of calls about SBOMs. Oh, well, we'd like you to analyze all the SBOMs. We're happy to do that, but you've got 42,000 critical vulnerabilities right now. Would you like 90,000 critical vulnerabilities or 200,000? Because we can find them, but shouldn't we? Let's go after these first, right? Anyway.
Yeah, and I'll raise that up beyond vulnerabilities, but also sometimes ongoing attacks within your network. We have had customers that said, this HMI is infected in my environment right now. We have quarantined it from the network, and we're going to continue to operate with that malware on there for the next 8 months until we have scheduled downtime. That is a decision, when you look at your risk and other requirements that you have, based on your operational requirements. And so, dealing with risk as impact and probability, right? The combination of the two, sometimes is about how do you reduce that probability versus reducing the impact. Now you can reduce the impact or the probability to zero if you patch, but there are other ways to reduce that probability. From a technological perspective, one of the things that we're able to do is identify those vulnerabilities and protect them within the firewall. And so using the IPS system within the firewall, we can detect that somebody's trying to exploit that vulnerability and then black hole the traffic, create the alarm, et cetera.
Okay, we timed that perfectly. It's 5:30 right now, unless we have
So,
another question.
time's
out
up.
there. Time is up. Thanks, everybody, for coming in for the last session. I know everybody's kind of tired, but I want to thank our presenters and our panelists, too. They did a great job.